running out of ammo. One of the men that was with him had got hit in the leg, and the leg was, broken from the round that hit his leg, and he's trying to carry him, get across a flooded field, which he thought may get him back to the American lines. And when he pulls him up and crawls up on the bank with him, there was a German from the 15th Parachute Infantry Regiment with his MP40 standing right there greeting them. He looked around and summed it up really well. He says, "We're about to find out what tough really is."
An excerpt from today's guest, whose latest book recounts the faith, courage, and hardscrabble life of a North Carolina World War II infantryman. Award-winning documentary filmmaker and author Mark Hager is here, and I'll speak with him right after this break. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Welcome back. Today's guest is a historian and an award-winning documentary filmmaker based in North Carolina. He co-produced the Tele award-winning The Border States of America, a documentary that paints a picture of the U.S. Mexico border through the eyes of sheriffs, ranchers, and residents in each border county. He also produced The Last Gathering, the 75th anniversary of D-Day. His latest book is The Last of the 357th Infantry, Harold Frank's World War II story of faith and courage. And author Mark Hager joins us now. Mark, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's been an exciting time.
Well, it's going to be fun, because I always love talking about World War II. And you have done several films on World War II and written several books on World War II. What was it about Harold Frank's story that drew you in?
It's kind of a multitude of different things, and that it's the first real book. And here it is. I got it just fresh off the press, even though it's officially not supposed to be released yet. But this would be the first on it. Normally, I'm really into documentaries, but this particular story was interesting in that when you look at the latest, when you think of the greatest generation, I have constantly looked and read at different books, and I've known several different authors, such as Shelby Foote, when you think of Civil War fame, and Bruce Catton. It's going back a little bit further, but I noticed that when you read some of these military histories, especially when you get into World War II, we can find lots of stories about the men and the units that went into action. But Harold and his ability to still be pretty sharp in terms of his thoughts and memory of going way back, I backed up and said, let's examine who this person is. Let's start from a child. And as he is building to become a man, and for his generation, and unfortunately or fortunate, depending on which perspective you're coming from, he had to become a man, when most Americans today are still considered to be kids.
Right. Yeah.
And his story is really riveting as a young child, growing up in rural Davidson County, North Carolina, with a very devout Christian or Lutheran family background. But his particular story is catching in that when you deal with a person who innovates so well as he did, you can find his mode of survival with a few events, a particular one when he's just 5 years old. So, and that's when I stopped. I said, let's back up. Let's get into his mind. Let's walk with him from the age of 5. And that covers the first 6 chapters practically, as he gets to the point to where I think a reader will say, this is what they had to do day in and day out, from the time he got up to the time he went to sleep, and then events that happened during that time period and those years. I don't know if we can compare it to anything today.
The Great Depression you're speaking about.
Mm-hmm. The Great Depression and the farm community, it actually hit earlier. in the farm community, the Depression had already hit hard by, say, the 1926, 27 era. Of course, we think of the Dust Bowl that was already occurring, but that's not right here in North Carolina. But the price and the effect on what it did to the farms and the struggle of the family farm trying to figure out a way to make it before the Great Depression becomes official everywhere. And this story of innovation, the story of resilience, the story of a profound view of faith and duty, and assuredly the idea of family, and the family having to pull all together. There's no complaining. There's doesn't matter the age, doesn't matter what's going on during the day. It has to be done. There's no arguing.
Right.
This is it. And so you pull all those resources together and then get into that grime, that real grit that it took to pull through, and it changes your perspective in life and the realization of what daily chores are going to be.
And he was able to remember back to that time?
Yeah, it took, and then talking others with some of the family, and then going through some of the records and traveling over to the family farm back near Tyro, North Carolina, which is still a very quaint location. Then I was able to pull that together, and then I found a few events that to where the aha moment for a writer happens. You're going, this is what this event right here foreshadowed what happens when he's a POW in Nazi Germany in Dresden that gets firebombed while he's there, and what happens when he is cut off and behind lines fighting the Germans earlier before he gets captured and wounded. You can point to events that happened, things that he did, and then see, oh well, that he had a similar event in which he had to change some resources as a young kid to be able to handle an event that happened.
What was that event that happened that shaped the rest of his life?
Without giving away all of the book.
Absolutely, yeah, don't give away all the book.
You can say he realized before he ever fired his first weapon that the first thing you had to do before you did that was to be able to completely take it apart, put it back together, understood the amount of powder that it took to fire, whether it was an Ivy Johnson 12 gauge or the 22 single shot that he had, or even with the BB gun, in which they had to carefully shoot but only hit something they could pull the BBs back out of because they couldn't afford to buy anymore. Right. And so learn to be careful when you shoot and hitting what you're going after, but at the same time to conserve ammo and shells. They were keen on the farm, as Davie County was, and Davidson County all over. Bird hunting became an essential part of it, and of course, and then having an English pointer, but you didn't just go out to joy hunt. It was a hunt for food. Learn how the pointer operates, and then you had to learn wing and shot, and then figure out how when the covey would bust to where you only shot when two birds cross, because the dog is going to go after the singles anyway. There's no use to just shoot at something in the sky. Mm-hmm. It was so, and then you operate as a team. Whether it was his uncle and his dad hunting together with himself, they knew exactly where they were going to go, how to be able to handle whichever direction that the birds may fly, and then that carried over into strategies, whether it was rabbit or strategies for something as simple as using a slingshot to go after all kinds of different birds, whether it's meadowlarks, robins, blackbirds, etc. And then that carries over to being able to take care of the family hogs. And when we think of barbecue in North Carolina, that catches a lot of people's attention. But why they depended so much on pork, that comes out in the book and will be explained to anybody that is, poor, the amount of pigs that you can have if taken care of properly can feed that family, but it's not easy. It's a lot of hard work, and it depends on a lot of resourcefulness and so I backed up and I said, well, wait a minute, his dad had a famous statement, says, save everything but the squeal and shoot it so that it doesn't squeal. And so that was meant every single piece of meat, every single piece of fat, anything that could be turned into lard, you saved. And what couldn't be used just for lard, then you turn that around and use the ashes from the wood cook stove to be able to make the soap that they use to clean everything. When we think of lye soap, before they could afford Red Devil lye, they had to make it themselves. So that whole process of innovation and how they fixed their tools, because they had no hardware store to go to buy the tools. Wow. So they had to learn to make it. And most of the people around them were in the same boat, but they helped each other. And so whether it was his sister who could outpick him in a cotton field, which always was something he tried as hard as he could to be able to catch up with Naomi, that's his sister, but she beat him every single time. But and then they would turn around and use their weekends to try to pick somebody else's cotton and get enough so that they could get their mom and dad something that could help them. So their family home was in bad condition when he was a child, and when he was 5, he's awakened because there was an opportunity, but excruciating work, that they could get the timber that they needed, but they would have to cut it, mill it themselves, and then to be able to finally build a house. Of course, you look at that as the reader, and when it's over with, it's still a house without indoor plumbing, still a house that when you think of today, what they thought was great, we would say, well, that's not anymore, but a little bit more space. But and you carry that through it, and by the time you get to where he didn't volunteer for the army, he gets drafted like most Americans, and so the ability of the family survival is stopped because he has to go to war.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Next time, author Thomas McKenna will be here to discuss his new book, Moral Warrior.
So I think it's an important point that almost all the moral guerrillas I talk about were fighting as soldiers in an American army. Now, they were very irregular soldiers. And one of the ways they were irregular is that they were barefoot, they wore scraps of uniforms that carried very outmoded rifles, sometimes no rifles at all. And they were constantly plagued by shortages of ammunition. On the first mission that Adil was sent on with his men, they were allowed 2 rounds of ammunition each to carry out an attack on a Japanese garrison.
That's next time. And if you're enjoying this World War II episode, check out our earlier program about Ronald Spears and his band of brothers with author Jared Frederick.
One of the core elements of the book is his written correspondence with Dick Winters, because that truly gave us an insider perspectives in which they were very candid with each other about what they did and what they did not do during the Second World War. And so that was one of the really fascinating things, is that you saw these older men coming to terms with their celebrity that they were sometimes uncomfortable with.
You'll find the link to that show in this episode's description. Now, talk a little bit about his unit, the 357th.
Right. That's how when I first met him by accident, I saw the POW cap that he likes to wear. And then when he told me the unit, I realized, wait, time out. I was going, this is World War II. And he said, yes. And I realized the 357th, from my own military experience, and I was stationed in Germany in the Army back in the 80s and had ventured to, some of these sites. And so in reading about military history, I knew about the 90th Infantry Division, the famous Texas and Oklahoma tough hombres. And I was shaking my head, how do you get in that unit? Because he went to basic in Camp Shelby, Mississippi, which was the 69th Division. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with that background as a child. He knew weapons well. And when he was in basic with the 271st Infantry out of the 69th Division. Had a sergeant stood up, was holding a BAR, and told him what it was, which in the Army means badass rifle, not Browning automatic rifle.
Right.
And it's a little different, civilian world, military world. But told him that it could fire up to 400 rounds a minute if you knew what you was doing. And he raised his hand immediately, says, I want it. And when he got it, the first thing he did, not to shoot it, but to take it completely apart, which they had to, all of us in basic. You have to learn the M16 inside and out, backwards, forwards. But he was excited, so he could take it apart, put it together, he said, in a few days blindfold. And he excelled. And he going to the range, they tried to get him to stay at Camp Shelby to help train new recruits, and offered to give him the rank corporal from basic. But he said, I didn't come here to go to school. Came here to get this war over and fight the Japs and the Germans. Mm-hmm. And so one day on a about a 90-mile road march, it was going to ironically end with some amphibious training down near Gulfport, if it was. And then he gets pulled, and he looks around, and the other guys that Jeep had drove up, pulls these guys apart. He noticed they were BAR guys who had qualified well. And next thing you know, they're all being hustled out and given a 3-day pass, told to be back at like 6 a.m. on Monday, and then they're off to Camp Shanks. And then, as we know, they were preparing for the Normandy invasion, and ends up in England, which that was the hard part, is that what they were doing, he was training, and he tried to show some other people different inside and outs to do with the BAR while he was training in England. And then he's really a replacement, him and a whole group of others, and they're waiting, and they're being assigned to the 90th Division. They're training around them, but they didn't know yet. Mm-hmm. And then the 90th enters its combat scene around the 357th actually came ashore on D-Day. Some elements of it, but they were there to prepare for the entire division to come in on June the 10th.
I see.
And then by about June the 10th, somewhere between the 10th and the 12th, then the groups coming in that are going to be backing them up, which means the replacements, the equipment, etc., are all coming in. And by the 12th, he and his assistant gunner are immediately pulled, loaded up, and head to the rendezvous point of the 90th Infantry Division near Point L'Abbe. That's at the Lafaire Causeway, for those who know military history. And then he enters combat at that point as the Battle of Gorbeville takes place. Amfreville, I think, was nearby, Equivenaville, key little crossroads. And the 90th Division's toughest fight will be from there through the Battle of Boucadre.
Was it during this time that he was captured during that battle?
Just before St. Lo, as the Battle of Boucadre. So you had Gorbeville. Well, you had the Lafaire Causeway infighting between the Lafaire Causeway and shortly a little bit further up the road at Point L'Abbe, that crossroad. And then you had continued fighting around Hill 122 and Gorbeville, which was horrendous. That's where the 357th lost about 115% of its men, which meant two things. One, many of the people that Harold first met were gone. And then two, most of the veterans now are the replacements that came in right as the battle was progressing, and which also meant he doesn't know anyone's name because he's from the 69th, 271st, and thrown in as a BAR man, which has to be on every patrol, because that's the only machine gun in an infantry squad. Right. So it's difficult for him, and so he knows one person. That's his assistant gunner, Paul Esworthy, and together, they fight it out and learn and then adapt quickly, but they never really got to know a name of, but just a handful of people as they went, and then the unit gets chewed up and mauled up from that point. And then he's the last well-experienced BAR man, and was selected while they were finally getting some rest on July, right after Independence Day. July the 5th, they had captured 17 Germans at a railroad cut, and got their first hot shower since before the initial D-Day landings. New change of uniforms, got to write a few letters home, and then they came and got them and said 2 companies, that was I and L Company of the 357th, they had lost contact with. They had one NCO that came through it, and they needed a patrol to go out and try to make contact with them and have an engineer to go with them to try to restore communication. And it was a night patrol. Harold is leading it out with his BAR man, but because of the difficult nature of it, he had, told his assistant gunner to stay back, several people back, and they ended up getting caught in an ambush. Harold is on one side of the road, the others are cut off on the other, still on the side that they hadn't crossed yet, and he's trapped on that side. And he actually finds 2 or 3 survivors of those 2 lost companies.
Oh.
And they fight it out for 9 hours. He gets shot in the shoulder, and running out of ammo, one of the men that was with him got hit in the leg, and the leg was, broken from the round that hit his leg, and he's trying to carry him, get across a flooded field, which he thought may get him back to the American lines. And when he pulls him up and crawls up on the bank with him, there was a German from the 15th Parachute Infantry Regiment with his MP40 standing right there greeting them. And so he got the trigger mechanism quickly undone from his BAR and threw it into the flooded swamp, so that would be of no use to the Germans from his BAR. And then he looked around and summed it up really well. He says, "We're about to find out what tough really is."
Yeah.
And they executed the guy that had the fractured leg because he couldn't walk. And then Harold hid his wound as best he could in his shoulder.
Let's skip forward to his time at his second POW camp at Dresden. Seems like part of the book is focused on that.
Yeah, it is.
What did he take from that? I don't want to give away anything in the book, but what were some of his feelings towards that time?
Well, it still goes back to that childhood, and he's constantly looking and evaluating the condition and what needs to be done. And he realized, one, he will first tell you where God's intervention happens, because technically some of the men were staying away from him because the stench from the wound that was infecting from his shoulder and was actually causing a fever with him, that he was saying if something doesn't happen, he's a goner. And they look, right at that point, the Germans threw into the barn where they were holding them a U.S. Army medic who had been captured, and they let him keep his medic bag.
Oh.
And he recognized that something was wrong with Harold and went up and said, "If you don't mind, I won't be able to pull the round out of your shoulder, but I can heal it, if you'll let me." And so, he will say emotionally that medic saved my life, but he couldn't lift his arm up very high.
Right.
And but they were there long enough to where he got the infection under control before they moved him out by railhead. And the whole railhead experience is something that I think the readers are going to be completely taken back about how the Germans treated them on the trains, some of the things they did deliberately to them. Miraculously, he survives that. But then he makes it into Dresden at Stalag 4B, and the conditions are horrendous. And he realizes if they stay there, and he he would tell me he could hear people mumbling, "We're going to die, we're going to die," because of how much or the lack of food and bad water. So he was looking for anything, and him and a couple other Southern boys, there was about 3 of them, that at least they kind of teamed up to know this is going to be an effort of several of us to try to survive this. And they volunteered when a German came in and offered a work detail and said, "We can get out of here. Maybe it could be whatever that could happen with being moved somewhere." And so what ends up happening is they're taken to Klachi Airfield, just outside of Dresden. And there they were put in a work camp and worked in a pulp factory where, that's like making paper, where they forced them to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. But he would say, but the food was better. But wait till you read in the book what better was.
Yeah.
And that really helps you to understand if that's better than what it was in the Stalag, then it's amazing anyone survived. And how he learned to improvise. That slingshot when he was 5 years old that he learned to make in his sleep, well, he was able to recraft that. And him and those 3 men together, without the Germans knew it, were able to get food that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to get using that slingshot, and developed a plan on how to use it without the Germans noticing it. And so that gets pretty cool. But then I'm going, man, all the things that his favorite uncle taught him when he was a boy, along with his dad, that were everyday things on the farm, he's reintroducing right there in that POW camp.
He's using the skills he learned. We're rapidly running out of time, and it sounds like we've left a lot for the reader to get excited about. But I wanted to ask you if you have a follow-up project to this book.
Yes, I am. I've got another veteran. Unfortunately, he passed away during COVID, not from COVID, but it became interesting. I met him again by accident, and this was having to do with the 75th anniversary of D-Day, but he was with the 82nd Airborne, did all jumps with the 82nd during World War II, stayed in through Korea, and then they forced him to retire during Vietnam.
I see.
But what drew me to him was he remembered when the 90th Division showed up at the LaFayette Causeway and how excited he was to see them. And then they both, his parachute infantry regiment and roughly what I think was Harold's Company G 357th group, both were pulled back at the same time. Ironically, they probably met each other while they were getting showers and meals, because he saw them coming in and they were next in line to get showers and such. And so it drew me to him. And then his story, when I went to interview him at his house as a young kid, very similar to Harold's. And the only reason he went airborne was because they lost their farm during the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma and were living in the tent. And he had watched his mom drop dead when he was 6, working in cotton fields. So you got similarities, and that the only reason he goes airborne, he couldn't believe he could get $50 to jump out of a plane. Yeah. And he said, my dad needs it. A dad's got to have that. So he goes airborne to help save the family. That's kind of that same cohesion of the family unit.
The book is called The Last of the 357th Infantry, Harold Frank's World War II story of faith and courage. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Okay, well, thank you, and look forward to talking with you again. You be safe.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. Next time, author Thomas McKenna will be here to discuss his new book, Moral Warrior.
So I think it's an important point that almost all the moral guerrillas I talk about were fighting as soldiers in an American army. Now, they were very irregular soldiers. And one of the ways they were irregular is that they were barefoot, They wore scraps of uniforms that carried very outmoded rifles, sometimes no rifles at all. And they were constantly plagued by shortages of ammunition. On the first mission that Adil was sent on with his men, they were allowed 2 rounds of ammunition each to carry out an attack on a Japanese garrison.
That's next time. And be sure to check out our Point of the Spear YouTube channel with bonus video material plus full military history documentaries. There's tons to explore, and I hope you check it out. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.